But we're going to have a lively discussion about disagreements and how to navigate those. And I'm excited about that. And quite frankly, I'm not sure why we're having this conversation because I don't have anybody in my life that I disagree with,
No.
and nor do I know anybody that has disagreements with me.
You've never had a strong opinion
Yeah.
in your life either.
Right. So, no, this is going to be
of us have.
extremely relevant, especially as we usher in Thanksgiving next week and the holidays in general. We often find ourselves surrounded by individuals that we love, that we care about, but that have differing opinions. And that just happens when you join new families or with your existing family, when you kind of get introduced to new cultures. So this is going to be fun. And I'm sure a lot of people are like, yeah, help me with this.
Yeah, I think everyone has at least that one in-law or that one uncle who has like a weird take on something that you find hard to connect with sometimes. And I think
several actually.
Yeah, several. And sometimes even the people that we are closest to, it can be hard to connect with them, especially when you're only seeing them occasionally a few times a year, and you want those experiences to be really positive and warm.
And not, I mean, this conversation is relevant at, throughout my entire life, this has been a relevant conversation, but more today than ever before. I mean, we definitely find ourselves in a unique climate. That's not even up for debate. Like, this is a unique climate with regard to a number of subjects and topics that have a lot of people feel like there's a lot of consequence to some of these opinions. Like these things matter. Yeah. And so you have to agree with me. So I'm excited to dig in with you, Lori, and it's going to be fun. So why don't you take us away? Let's start off with just, how do you want to take it? How do you want to begin with this?
Yeah. I mean, I think before getting into those heavy topics, there's something really important about building on relationships first. Having a strong bond with people that comes before you even dig into those things. So especially when you're catching up with people, it can be hard to know how to talk to people. Like, nobody likes small talk. Nobody likes just covering these surface level, shallow things. And when you're not sure how to connect with people, sometimes it can be kind of hard to get there. So we have kind of three big pieces of advice. First, ask open-ended questions. Listen authentically, and build off of common ground. I would say those are kind of our three main things that I would say as just general principles.
So this is kind of an overview.
This is an overview. This is any conversation you're having. An example of kind of what open-ended questions might look like, because that's easy to say and harder to execute sometimes. What are you most looking forward to next year? You can ask questions about like, how's work going, right? But that can be answered with one word. Oh, good, it's fine. Ask follow-up questions. Find the things that people are passionate about. If you're not sure what they're passionate about, ask them what they're passionate about these days. Those can be ways to get into something.
This kind of stuff is really good for the individual that is wanting to kind of be proactive with healthy discussion and dialogue. Saying, okay, I'm going to take the lead here. When I find myself at the dinner table with Uncle so-and-so, or when I'm sitting with my in-laws who, we're very different, I'm going to take the initiative to kind of like steer a conversation that's fruitful, that's not just small talk, that's going to be healthy. And so these open-ended questions can be helpful in that regard, right?
Yeah, and it can be easier said than done, right? Like it can be kind of awkward. Like one of the examples we have is, what's worrying you lately? Like that might not be a question that's easy to just bring up out of the blue. In fact, any kind of open-ended question can be hard to just be like, I'm going to start a conversation about this thing, but having the courage to kind of like jump in and be like, hey, let's all talk about this more serious thing.
And even mean it, right? Like, so rather than just like, here's a list of open-ended questions that I wrote down from this webinar that I saw, or I got off of Google, getting a list and saying like, if you really are going to be asking the question, what's worrying you right now? Like, or whatever that was. What was the example again?
Yeah. What's worrying you right now? Or what are you most excited about right now?
So if you're going to ask that question, like, it's probably something that you ought to genuinely care about.
Right.
Like you say, well, I'm ready to go here because there's some things that are worrying me, or there's some things that I'm excited about that like I want to share, and it's not just kind of like a checklist here.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the second point, listen authentically, comes in, right? You don't just ask the questions to ask the questions to fill out a checklist. Like, actually try to hear what people are saying and listen for things that you have in common. I think that's the way that a conversation can start to flow really organically, is when you ask those questions, you listen, you ask what they're interested these days, and you hear something that you're like, oh, that's a topic that I'm really fascinated by. Tell me more. Tell me more about that thing. That tell me more is a really good way to keep, digging deeper rather than just skimming the surface.
So, some of us, some out there are really good at this naturally. Like this is like comes easy. It's like good, and we all know those people. We all know those people in our lives that are just excellent conversationalists. They just kind of like immediately they just get to the core and they dig deep, and you leave an interaction with them, and you're not just talking about the weather or like a one line, how's work?
Right.
Good. It's going good. Yep.
Right.
Good. You kind of leave those conversations with those individuals that are really good at this, and you're like, wow, they really saw me, And so I guess part of this is like, how can we emulate that? If that comes natural to you, fantastic. You're probably, doing just fine in this category. And again, we're going to talk about the hard conversation in a second, because that's not always easy for even the good conversationalists. But if that's you, that you're already good at this, fantastic. If that's not you, if you're kind of like I don't even know where to begin, this is great guidance for you to kind of say, like, give it a bit of a process until it can kind of come naturally for you. And the underlining tone that you're saying to me and that I'm hearing is that at the baseline is like, be genuine, be authentically listening, like be that. But here are some things to prompt that.
Yeah.
But don't let that overshadow the true interest that you want to convey.
Right. And I think if you find yourself, if you aren't one of those people to whom this comes naturally, a good rule of thumb is follow the example of every 3 or 4 year old who just asks why. And then you explain why, and they say, well, why?
I happen to have a 4-year-old right now, so
know how that's like.
Hitting home for me, but
but just to keep prying. Tell me more. Okay, pry maybe is a bad word. You can, if people are closed off and don't want to talk about a topic, that's fine. Pivot, but tell me more. Tell me more.
Yeah.
Why? Why do you feel that way about this? Like, you can dig deeper and get at real subjects that you can both feel like you're connecting over if you just are willing to keep pursuing a line of conversation rather than just skimming the surface over a bunch of topics to be like, oh, now we, everything that could fit on a Christmas card, I now know about you, how you were this year. Like, find something to engage with.
Okay, so those are some good what to do's.
Yes.
What about what not to do's?
So let's start there. So one really popular piece of advice you'll hear a lot is, when it comes to family gatherings, don't talk about politics, religion, or money.
Some big ones.
Those are some big things, right? And that is something that you'll hear all the time, just colloquially. Don't talk about these things. Just put them off the table completely.
I'm always talking about my 401k.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just all the time.
Yeah, so stressed about it. But those subjects kind of have a way of coming up naturally.
Yeah.
I know in a lot
they can be good. They can be fantastic conversations.
Absolutely, they can, and we'll get there. I think that in a lot of families too, like, maybe the thing they're passionate about is politics. Maybe the thing they're passionate about is religion, right? Some of those things are so inextricably tied and important and core to people as individuals and identity. Yeah, that completely trying to avoid those topics would be like trying to skirt around an elephant in the room. So I would give different advice than don't talk about these things. I wouldn't call this a don't. I would say do talk about religion and politics and money in a better way.
Okay.
Talk about them in a healthier way with appropriate boundaries in place, and when people feel comfortable and welcome at the table to have these kinds of conversations, which is easier said than done.
Yeah, let's get into it.
It's easier said than done because, like you alluded to earlier, we are in a unique climate right now, especially politically, where there is polarization, there is tension between this red and blue, right? And sometimes these are kind of imaginary lines that we've drawn for ourselves, where there's more of a spectrum of people, but we tend to look at this other group and see them as like the most extreme version of something, and we tend to think these things about them. So in the last 8 years, from 2016 to 2022, in the categories of closed-mindedness, dishonestness, immorality, intelligence, all these things, both parties see the opposition as being more closed-minded, more dishonest, more immoral. Like those ratings, when they ask to say, how do you feel about the other side, in some cases have gone up 10 to 30% in every single category.
We villainize. Exactly. And unfortunately, the sources to which we turn for information about opposing views tend to perpetuate that villainization.
Absolutely,
correct?
yeah. You see so often someone is like holds up an example of some really extreme version of a belief or a mindset or a political view, and will say, "Look at these bad people and what they think," where the reality is a lot more nuanced than that. But I find these numbers interesting because I think if we are coming to a conversation with these kinds of assumptions about the other person, if we are coming to a conversation being like, I think that you and your people are immoral. I think that you and your people are closed-minded or unintelligent or lazy.
If that's the starting point.
Yeah, if that's the starting point to where you're coming to this conversation with a person, you're not going to be hearing each other. And that is a problem because oftentimes we love these people. And if we come to the table with these assumptions, it can be difficult.
I'm going to pause you there because I think most people listening would agree with that. Like, most people listening would say like, yeah, sure, of course. Like, and I'm not one of those people that do that. Like, but I know some of my neighbor,
right.
Most people would say that. But the reality is that we all come to the table with even subconsciously with some ideas about other views and other opinions and people that don't believe what I believe. And if I quickly identify you as somebody that is not in my camp or not part of my team, it's really hard not to make all sorts of assumptions about an individual, right? And we can make it
other people, right?
Other people. And it's easy, when we talk about large groups of people and parties and institutions, it's really easy to villainize. And when we come down to an individual communication, we can sometimes say, well, I don't agree with these people. Well, but except for you. You're the exception.
You're one of
right?
the good ones. Yeah, you're okay.
But I guess I'm just looking for maybe some guidance for the for us to check our blind spots in that regard, because I think most of us come to the table unintentionally with some of that baggage because of the ecosystem in which we live. It's almost impossible not to be tainted or persuaded to have strong opinions. And it's not to say that all that actually exists in the world is common ground.
Right.
There are true disagreements.
Absolutely.
And those disagreements can actually have consequences that matter. But I think that coming at it with pitchforks is one approach, and coming at it with a desire to understand is a whole other experience. And I think that's what you're trying to get to.
Yeah. As humans, we have this psychological desire to put things in boxes. It's how we make sense of the world, by categorizing things. And unfortunately, we do it to people too. We categorize people as part of this entity, this group. And it takes a lot of effort to fight past that. It's also really human to feel if someone else comes at you with all these assumptions about you, it's really easy to get on the defensive and to feel attacked. And when you feel attacked, if your stress levels are going up, that's doing things to you physiologically. Like, you are not thinking as clearly when you are feeling like you need to defend yourself emotionally. It can put your body in a state where you feel like you need to defend yourself physically, and we get dumber in our conversations when they start to get really heated. So those are challenges to overcome. It takes a lot of courage to be the person who knows that someone else might be coming to a conversation with these assumptions about you, and to be the one that says, I'm going to set aside these assumptions that I have, even if you're coming to me with these negative assumptions, and I am going to now try to bring something different to the table.
So, okay, I'm just going to we'll move past this, but I just have one more thing I want to cover on this, because all this is fantastic, and checking yourself, checking your blind spots, coming to the table with a true opportunity for finding that common ground, fantastic. And if we can really absorb that, great. All the listeners, fantastic.
Yeah.
What do you do? And I'm not sure if we're going to cover this here in the webinar, but I truly don't know what we talked about. Like, you have prepared this, and I'm just here having a good conversation with you. But what about coming to the table where you're the open-minded, where you're the one kind of saying, okay, I am willing to give the benefit of the doubt, and I'm willing to kind of say, like, we can have honest to goodness disagreements, and you can still be a good, moral human being. Even with those disagreements, and the thoughtful individuals can come to different conclusions.
Yeah.
And I might hold that perception. But what if you, my friend,
my
my
weird
neighbor,
aunt.
my
Your
weird aunt, or whatever.
Aunt, yeah.
Like, you are not coming to the table with that. How do I engage with you, knowing that you're not attempting to do that? You are coming to the table with strong opinions of like, oh, you're one of those people, and therefore.
Yeah.
So how do I engage with you?
That's a great question, and we'll get there. I think there are cases where sometimes setting some healthy boundaries and saying, we are going to avoid this particular topic for our relationship, or we are going to set aside how much we're going to talk about it, come up with a controlled environment to talk about this. There are ways and times in which you do need to remove yourself from a conversation. But I think there is something powerful about being the one who sets everything down first. If you set your weapons down first, people are less likely to attack you.
Disarming.
Yeah, it's disarming when you disarm yourself first.
Okay.
So so here are a few don'ts.
Okay.
Don't speak in generalities about a malicious this other group, these people who are out to get you, because the reality is most of the time that person, there are far fewer of those people than you think. And so when you lump a whole category of people into this them, you risk alienating the people that you love.
Yeah, and actually, I think that's good advice, because oftentimes, and I found myself in this situation where like I'm in a setting in which maybe the dominant political opinion or opinion in general is assumed to be one direction, and so the feeling of the room is like that we're all in agreement, and so we can talk in these generalities and say they, when in fact sometimes I found myself on the other side of that, where it's like I'm among this, but I'm actually on that other side. You don't know that I'm on the other side, and so this is really uncomfortable for me, because you're talking in generalities as if we're in agreement, but we're actually not. Like that's a dangerous place, and no one wants to put people in that position.
Yeah.
So it's like, be careful with those generalities.
Exactly.
Be careful with like assuming, we hold the similar values or beliefs or understandings of what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good advice for anyone going into any kind of conversation, is maybe assume that the person you're talking to, there are probably things about them that you don't know, and about their beliefs, about their life experience, that you might be missing context on. And if you just assume that we're all together in this camp because you happen to be the people I love, so you assume that we share every ideal, you could, you can harm people that way. And then I think on the flip side, you don't want to assume the worst about people too, right? If you have that, maybe a relative that you have conflict with, maybe imagine that they wake up in the morning and they want to live a good life and have happiness and be a kind person, and they're maybe not out to destroy the world, right? Because I think it can be easy for us to forget that everyone is the main character of their own story, just trying to do the best that they can. One more don't is don't jump to saying you're wrong, here's why. A better approach is to use I language. So I have a different experience with this. Is it okay? Can I share? Yeah. So when people, maybe you are the person in the room and everybody else is talking in generalities, rather than saying you guys are way off base here, use I language. I actually have a different perspective on this. Can I share kind of my experience?
And here's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, exactly.
And here's what I've observed. And both can be true, but this is kind of how maybe we're not considering these positions.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's good. I have an individual. I'm going to have to keep this pretty general. I have an individual in my life that we very much have differing opinions on certain things. We connect in a lot of great ways, and when it's around other subjects and other things, it's great. It's fantastic. We get along. But when we get into certain topics of discussion, it's super clear and super evident that it's just like it's kind of a toxic area to go, and kind of like landmines everywhere, and it can get heated. And I'm generally the one trying to diffuse, like, and kind of avoid, but sometimes it goes there. And so this is helpful for me to kind of say, okay, how. And there are times where I've had to just remove myself and say like, hey, well, agree to disagree, and like move on.
And that will happen sometimes. Sometimes you will drill into an issue and you will find that at the core of it, there might be something that you simply can't get on board with each other.
I guess, and the point I'm trying to make with this is that there was a time where I was really on a crusade to change them, to kind of like open their minds to a more, to be more compassionate and understanding of these other points of view. And I was trying to kind of like move them out, away from such extreme perspectives into a more like, hey, there's good on both sides of this, and people have general good intent and that kind of thing. I was like on a mission to make that happen, and by attempting to go there, in some ways I made it worse. I mean, it's still a good mission to go, to try.
It's really difficult.
But I had to draw some boundaries.
Yeah.
I had to draw some boundaries, saying, you know what, I just got to let them, have those perspectives.
Absolutely. And I mean, we'll go into boundaries a little bit more, but there are different ways you can do that, right? Sometimes it is, you can diffuse, you can change the subject. You can diffuse with humor sometimes. You can be like, all right, guys, like, whoa, I got some big opinions on this one. I'm going to need to go get my boxing gloves out of the car if we're going to carry this any farther. Like there are different ways that you can interact with the people that you know and love in ways that you know they will respond to.
Would you actually go get your boxing gloves?
There have been times when I've gotten close.
So that's a thing. You have those? Okay.
Yeah, I keep them there just in case. Just in case.
Good.
It's tricky. But I want to come back to a couple other do's quickly when you are trying to engage with these conversations. There will be times when you may need to pull out of them. But when you're trying to have these hard conversations with people, we've touched on this, but remember to humanize the person that you're talking to. People always believe things for reasons that make sense to them, even when they don't make sense to you. Everyone has had a whole life worth of experience that they are coming to this moment and this conversation with. Sometimes it helps to try to understand them. You can say something like, I've got a really different opinion on this, but I want to understand you better. I want to understand
Help me understand
why you think that, because you might be also throwing out arguments that aren't even addressing the problem that they really have once you drill down into it. So that's a good start. And then the same pieces of advice that apply to any conversation will apply to a difficult conversation too. You do want to ask those open-ended questions and listen authentically and build off of common ground. This is scarier to do when the topic is hard, but authentic listening can look like having that courage to sit there with that discomfort of knowing that you believe the other person has a really bad take and sticking with it anyway and trying to hear them. When you're trying to ask open-ended questions, that's also really scary, because then you are submitting yourself to having to hear maybe this viewpoint that is difficult for you to hear. But just like if you're sharing your own experience, you say, hey, I've had a different take on this. You can ask them, what experiences have you had that lead you to feel this way? And then it's that same question. Tell me more.
So in part what you're saying is that rather than trying to convert, it's trying to understand, and that simple kind of like shift in one's mind will allow the conversation to conclude in a way that everyone kind of walks away with a better knowledge. Maybe no one changes their opinions or whatnot. And I guess the foundation of this is trying to avoid arguments. We talk about our goal here is to enter the holiday season, go to Thanksgiving dinner without the arguments. Just let's have conversations, and if it goes into these territories, let's understand.
Exactly. Let's have a healthy conversation about it if the conversation is going to happen, which may not always be the best route. But if the conversation is going to happen, let's do it in a way that we can still build on a foundation of having love for each other, having respect for one another, believing about the other person rather than all of those negative things, being able to leave a conversation saying, all right, I don't agree with everything you say. You don't have to validate or condone what they're doing or what they believe, but to be able to say, I believe you're still a good person. I believe you're an intelligent person. You came to these conclusions for reasons that make sense to you.
But and that's where it's hard, where you have to challenge your own beliefs, because like sometimes you just don't feel that they are intelligent.
Right.
Well, I'm just saying, like sometimes you're like, because it's nice if you say, hey, I believe that you're an intelligent person. I believe that you have good intent, and sometimes
you don't.
You don't feel like
and don't say that if you're lying, But like, you can still believe that someone has good intentions, right? Like I think at the bare minimum, can we drill down to a point that we can understand people's intentions, and I think that can be really useful in helping us maintain those relationships and have positive relationships with these people that are kind of tethered to us often, whether they're the people we would have chosen or not. So But that's, it's tricky. I think a lot of times you can build off common ground, though. You can find something at the core where you go, hey, we might have really different takes on this, but I think at the core we both want this. Like, we both believe this core thing, even about this topic.
Well, so, examples of that are that, if it does get into the realm of politics, I often, think about politics in the sense that, both parties are looking for a strong middle class, a healthy economy, and prosperity, right?
Yep.
And everyone wants that, and so to get there, sometimes we have to
windy routes, right?
Yeah,
different routes.
To get there. There's different opinions on how to get there, but we're all striving for that. Rather than we have two different destinations entirely, and that we're trying to kind of like take away from the other party in order to gain our ground. And I think that's. In some subjects and topics that may be more true, where it's more binary.
Yeah.
In other things, it's true that the destination can be reached through a number of different trails.
Yeah. There's a picture on an earlier slide that I'm going to skip back to really quick. Sorry, we lost the picture there for a second. It's this one with, maybe you're familiar with it. It's a shape. Usually it's like a cylinder, and there's a light shining on it both ways. And what that represents is that two people can look at an object and be standing in different places and see a completely different object. There are versions of this that look like a triangle from the top too, right? It's kind of wedge shaped. And where you're standing can completely dictate the reflection that you see.
Suggesting that both perspectives are true. They're just different
sometimes,
vantage
right?
points.
They can be. That may not be true of every single topic, but a lot of the time you start drilling down into it, and you're right. People are like, oh, well, I want this for people. And you can both go, yeah, I also want this for people. We might disagree about the route to get there.
Yeah. Anyway, and this is just helping us kind of like take a less charged attitude into these conversations, to recognize that there's a lot of perspectives out there and intent. All this is helping me enter into my holiday season to kind of say, okay, people are generally good. People generally want to do good. People generally want similar things. We might have different perspectives on that, and being open to those different perspectives.
Yeah, and just being willing to be the one who listens. And hopefully at the end of that conversation, you can say, wow, I understand you better. Maybe I can share a little bit about where I'm coming from too.
Okay.
Being able to hopefully leave that conversation both having a little bit better understanding. Sometimes things might get too heated though. Like, that's just a reality, because you can only control yourself in any.
Have you ever been in a conversation where it was so heated that you had to remove yourself? Is that?
That's there have been times where I have had to say, hey, I don't think that we're speaking about this in a productive way right now. I think this is a really important topic. I don't think we're addressing it in a healthy way. Can we talk about this another time? Like, can we take the time that we need to cool off on this and address it another day? And that's what a boundary looks like, right? Like, people, we throw the word boundaries around a lot, and sometimes it's hard to know exactly what that looks like. But that's what it can look like. It can look like, hey, I want to hear more about your thoughts on this. I want to understand you, but can we sit down another time? I don't think this is the time or place, right? And maybe someone will keep pushing against that boundary, and you have to go, I'm gonna remove myself. Like, physically take yourself into another room. Sometimes that's necessary. Hopefully, these boundaries can be set in advance. Doing some healthy prep work, right? We put in so much prep work to our holiday gatherings, getting decorations and food and all of these things ready, doing all the planning. If we're spending hours and hours and hours doing that, how about 10 minutes to call up a member of your family and just say, hey, maybe there is a topic that you think you just know it's going to be too explosive, and you say, hey, can we shelf this one?
Yeah.
Or, hey, can we schedule time to yell at each other about this another time, right? You can have that conversation in advance, and it can help
so that
the event itself.
Yeah, the event will go along smoothly.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. Sometimes there are times where it might be appropriate to recruit your sibling class clown to just like have not a gossipy conversation, but a productive conversation to say, hey, I'm worried about this getting explosive. Like, will you have my back to help me? Maybe you're one of those people who's awkward in social situations, but you have that friend who's really charming and charismatic, and you can say, hey, I get really uncomfortable when so-and-so brings up this topic. Can you help me to steer? And that can be an appropriate way to prepare as well. So there are different options for kind of drawing these kinds of boundaries, getting people on board with having healthy conversations and establishing some ground rules.
Yeah, some people look at the holidays as a rejuvenating and beautiful opportunity to connect with like-minded family members, and just like it's all rainbows and sunshine. And for others, there's a bit of anxiety or dread with with connecting with those individuals that are more charged and that you don't agree with that much. And so I think that if somebody's watching this that is on the former, where they're just like, this is beautiful, they're just like, well, what are we even talking about? This is fantastic. I cannot wait. And I think that most of us have that is the dominating emotion, but there are those moments where you're just kind of like, okay, how do I navigate this appropriately? Because last year this happened, and I can't repeat that because that was devastating.
Yeah, and can you see those things coming? I think most of us can, right? If something happened last year, what can you do to prepare differently this year to make sure that doesn't happen? And sometimes that might mean awkward conversations. Anytime you're talking about if you start to get meta about communication, it can be awkward to bring those topics up, to be like, hey, I don't like the way we're communicating about this. That can feel really awkward coming out of your mouth sometimes. So find a way to say it that feels natural to you. But again, it's a small act of courage to just talk to someone beforehand and say, hey, I would love to be able to have healthy, productive conversations. There's a website called Braver Angels, which it's about helping people have healthier political discussions. They have conversation guides and stuff like that. If you want to get that structured with it, right? You can build out expectations of how something is going to go before the fire starts, right? You can keep it a controlled burn.
I like that.
So to speak.
I like that. So what was that website again? It was Braver?
Yeah, it's Braver Angels.
Braver Angels, for a kind of a guide for having political or charged political conversations in a healthy way.
Yes.
I like that. Well, great. Is there anything else you want to share about this? I mean, I feel like if we can, just think if we all embraced these points and this guidance and feedback, we'd be in a whole different world in our climate today.
This isn't just about our families either, right?
Yes. This isn't just for the holidays, right?
Yeah.
This should be carried on into our conversations at work and beyond the holidays, in just our civility on how we handle one another and our differing opinions. So thank you. Thank you for sharing all of this. I'm sure we've had some questions come in in the chat, and we're going to pull those up if that is okay. So here we go. Here's from the chat. Here's a question. It says, how do you set healthy boundaries when it comes to sharing time with family over the holidays? Okay, so this is a legitimate one, especially when two families come together, in a marriage, in a partnership where it used to just all be one-sided, one family, but then all of a sudden it's like we need to go
now
to
both grandmas
locations.
Want you there or whatever. Yeah, absolutely.
And that can look at a lot of different ways. Like families can be in two different cities, and I've actually heard from a lot of people that it's sometimes more difficult when the families are in the same city, because there's an expectation that you're going to be a part of all of it.
You're just going to roll up. Yeah.
So just in general, let's cover that. When it comes to setting boundaries with conversations, we've talked about. What about with time?
Yeah, I think the same principles apply in terms of the prep work especially. I think the sooner you can have those conversations during a calm time, that's a good general rule for setting any kind of boundary, is they work best when you establish them in advance and during a time when you're both feeling level-headed and calm, not in the heat of the moment. So
And far enough in advance, people can kind of set expectations like, well, there's not like a warm meal sitting for you, and you like call in that day like, hey, that's not going to happen. We never really planned on coming. That can hurt a lot worse than obviously weeks prior to it saying, hey, this is how we're thinking about Christmas Eve or whatever, and it's saying, oh, okay, well then I won't prepare for that.
Right. So, and I think that, again, like any other part of this conversation, it can be scary because you can only control your side of the conversation. But I think that
if there's disagreement within the couple,
disagreement, right, and you can only, especially, when you're talking to in-laws or whatever, that, like, again, you can only control yourself here. But I think that, again, that prep work becomes really critical. You want to say, hey, maybe you can even do it in phases, right? You can say, hey, I feel pretty overwhelmed this time of year. Could we set a time to talk about like expectations for where we're going to be at different gatherings? we have a lot of demands on our time, and I would use that I language, right? I would like to figure out a solution where I can be there at an appropriate amount. Yeah. And so I think, again, that using that I language and doing the prep work to set up a conversation in advance.
I think where a lot of emotions come up that are negative around time is when those conversations didn't happen and assumptions are made as to like engagement and participation, and when those assumptions aren't met, like you're spending too much time with that, family because, or you didn't come around for this, or we expected you here. I think that when those conversations aren't had and there's just kind of assumptions occurring, that's when you can get into the dangerous territory.
That can get really sticky.
So having them up front, like right now for Christmas, start thinking about what you want your Christmas to look like. Start kind of envisioning what that time division will look like for your family. Just a few years ago, my wife and I, our family, we started to divide out. We used to divide it between like her family and my family. Now we're like carving out our time.
Right.
And so there's a third kind of party that's like, hey, we're going to have our time for Christmas morning that we didn't used to allow for. It was always at one or the other. And that's been a process to kind of communicate that. And so, I think it all comes down to open and honest communication.
Yeah, and I think you can gauge your family dynamics too. I think in general, it's probably better to have that conversation not over a text, right? Maybe have a phone call, maybe meet them in person and come up with other ways that you can make sure that they feel loved, and that, because I think a lot of people like have those kinds of expectations, feeling, again, they're coming to this conversation with all of their own baggage. Maybe they're going to feel abandoned, and you're worried about them feeling abandoned when you tell them this news. Like, what are things that you can do to kind of reassure them that, you still care about them, you still want to make time for them, but just that maybe this particular occasion or setting a precedent for doing things a certain way over the holidays.
So face to face better. If not that,
face to face,
TikTok,
video
interpret
call,
pants.
phone call. Yep, exactly.
One of those two.
One of those things. You got options.
There's options on the table. Okay, second question. Let's go to this. So stress makes all flights worse. Fights worse, not flights. Fights worse. I was going to say, what were we talking about? Okay, that's interesting. No, fights worse. How can you manage stress well, even when things are busier than usual during the holidays? So, yes, it's an amplifier, right?
Yes.
Stress can just make little things just turn into mountains. And so that's a good point. So it's almost like, how do we handle our stress before we enter into those situations where we can enter into those maybe previously charged environments? We can enter into them with a calm and cool head. That's hard.
That's really hard. I would recommend checking out a few months ago, one of our other episodes was on stress specifically. If you go to the Impact Suite YouTube channel, you should be able to find the previous episodes there.
On stress.
On stress.
That was with Sean Morris.
Yes, Sean Morris. Yeah. So that is a great question. I think it's definitely amplified during the holidays. A few basic things to keep in mind is that stress is a physical response that's not out to hurt you necessarily. Sometimes that stress can help us to take action, and even just that mindset shift of saying this isn't this feeling that I'm having in my body is preparing me to be able to take action, can help us actually reduce the overall stress levels and turn them from kind of distress into eustress. Again, always easier said than done, takes practice. But I would say, check out that if you want a deeper dive on the stress.
Great. And it's true that can perpetuate the challenges of it.
Absolutely.
We'll go to one more question here. So a lot of fights in my family happen over how kids are behaving. My kids are angels. I don't know what they're talking about. How do you handle differences in parenting when you're in a big group? Okay.
That's really challenging. You're a parent. Maybe you can speak to this better than I can.
I think let's establish kind of like how this comes about. Sometimes, like in a group environment, sometimes when all of my siblings, and I'm one of 7 siblings, or one of 7 kids in our family, and we are all adults now with kids, and when we all get together, we're all there, and kids are kind of flailing around, and there are different parenting styles there, and sometimes it's kind of like don't let your kid do that, or how come we would never allow that, all that can kind of like come up. So it's interesting because they're suggesting in this question, this person is suggesting that a lot of fights emerge out of these of the children's behavior and how you are handling. Why aren't you
stepping in to do this, or why are you stepping in? Why are you being? Yeah, like there's differences.
And luckily, this is not the case in my with my family, but I know this is the case for a lot of people where like in-laws can be, fairly
very
judgmental.
Different parenting styles.
Yeah,
right?
and they can come in and say things that really kind of rub you wrong or kind of upset you. So let's talk about that. I mean, would you say that similar things apply? I mean, so that's not so much a preparation thing around children's behavior because they're just volatile and
children
kind of
are
crazy,
just gonna do what they're
and they're
do
just tornadoes and terrible dinner guests.
Yes.
But so that's going to happen. That's going to just be a volcano that you can't control.
Right.
So how do we deal with it?
Though I do think there is some prep work that can happen on this. If you're asking this question, or if you hear this question and go, oh yeah, that's my family too, you can probably see these things coming, right? A little bit. You could see a conversation about parenting coming. And again, it's awkward to have the conversation, but to say, hey, I know we have different parenting styles on this thing. Maybe if you're hosting or something, you're like, could we keep the kids out of this room or whatever? Like, can we make sure that we do that just for the sake of family gatherings? Or like, what can I do to help us make sure that we are having a harmonious gathering there, right?
Okay,
I feel this way when this happens, right? Using that I language as much as you can.
I mean, there's so many angles to this particular question that we're not going to have time to go through all of it. But I guess I'm taking the perspective of like, I just said like, well, you can't really prepare for that. And I'm going to take that back because, but you're saying, well, there is a level of anticipation, like, hey, there is stress around this time that, typically, especially for this person, they say a lot of fights occur around this, meaning they have some precedent, they have some experience in this. And so where do those come from? Is it when they're trying to do a serious Thanksgiving dinner and say a blessing or do something that the adults want to have look a certain way and kids are just messing that up? And so is there a moment where that typically mounts and kind of crescendos? Or are there situations or other family members that you're particularly worried about, previous engagements that maybe were less positive and favorable, that you can kind of anticipate. So thinking through, like anticipating, like, okay, here's a stress point. This is a stress relationship. These are some pinpoints that I can identify that if I kind of think about this ahead, maybe have some previous conversations with, again, similar to what we talked about previously.
I think it's the same principles, right? Listening authentically, asking questions about, even if you're like, hey, I see, we have different perspectives on how we do this thing. I want to understand where you're coming from and maybe why you allow this behavior or why this is happening.
Or how can I help?
And that's another, I was just going to say, are there compromises that you can make? Like, how can I help you?
Now, those are hard. Those are hard conversations, though.
They
are. I mean, just if this person is referencing like, other kids, like this other family stresses me out, or we get in a lot of fights around this thing. Yeah. Confronting that is really difficult.
It's scary too, especially if you maybe have a volatile relationship in other ways and you're worried about the way they're going to react.
So I think, and tell me what you think about this, but I think a first step would be maybe addressing the situations that might diffuse or dampen the charged emotions.
Like how can you put up a baby gate somewhere? Right?
Well, but not even go so far as to saying like to address someone and saying, can you do?
No,
I
guess I mean you.
Okay.
The mysterious you. Can I put up a baby gate if I'm hosting and I'm worried about kids getting into something? Do I know someone who can help? Like, are there physical barriers? Are there emotional barriers that we can do? What can we do?
And if it comes to addressing a particular family or a particular child or a particular situation, these things will, guidance will very much help. But maybe there are some things as a precursor to really soften that.
Yeah, and it might be sometimes doing that kind of thing can help you kind of pick your battles of what arguments might come up. If you just say, okay, I know this thing might happen. Maybe it's not worth having a fight about, right? Maybe you can
recognizing that kids are kids.
You can recognize those boundaries in yourself too, and say, okay, I'm going to set a boundary with myself that when this comes up, I'm going to let it go, or I'm going to do what I can to prepare in advance for this situation. And beyond that, like maybe there are times when parents are going to parent in different ways, and it's hard to know when it's appropriate to
Having
criticize
compassion.
Someone else's parenting, right?
Yeah. After having become a parent, I have a lot more compassion for other parents and navigating that. When I used to, when I see a parent kind of getting upset with their child in the grocery store, I used to be like, oh, poor child. Now I'm like, what did that child do? How dare that child?
Yeah. It's a hard job.
I'm just saying that like there's a lot more compassion for what's going on. So, so this is fantastic. Thank you. And I wish we had more time to go into that, because there's so many nuances and maybe a follow up with this individual to talk about that family dynamic, because there's a lot of angles to that. But this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Lori. I appreciate that. And I just want to say thank you for everyone who wrote in and asked questions. And we'll try to provide more guidance for additional questions on the chat, as well as check for this video later on the channel and on the podcast. Should be available here soon, and we'll send out an email for those interested to remind them about that. Is there anything else? I think we covered the bases here today. We could talk more, but
I think it's a hard topic, and it can be overwhelming to approach it, especially if you're not a family that has done a lot of like formal boundary setting before or had these kinds of formal conversations. But I think it can really pay off to start introducing that into your dialogue with each other.
So if you want happier holidays and a way to connect with your friends and family during this time in a way that's not toxic, in a way that's productive, let's go through those first 3 guiding principles.
Yeah, so it's going to be sorry, I'm looking at the wrong notes here. But you're going to want to listen authentically. You want to find common ground. And then you want to ask open-ended questions whenever you possibly can.
I love it.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate it. We'll see you later.